Hello and welcome to MEELive. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Tuesday, the 16th of June, 2026. Today, a special deep dive. The US-Israel-led war on Iran and Lebanon is finally over. But is it only over on paper? On Sunday, Donald Trump marked his 80th birthday by announcing the United States had reached a deal to end the war with Iran after more than 100 days. Let the oil flow, he declared. Except it's not a deal, it's a memorandum of understanding, a vague agreement to extend the April ceasefire and negotiate the finer points thereafter. Beyond that, the contents are unclear, the details yet to be published.
One of the interesting things about the Iranian state media is that sometimes you'll have hardline elements really aiming at a domestic audience, trying to sell the deal, and in some ways, honestly, misrepresent the deal. And then sometimes you'll see certain elements in the Israeli media pick that up and run with it. I think when people see this deal, we hope to release the text this week, they're going to realize that this is going to make the whole region safer.
In the vacuum of solid information, competing narratives have emerged. Iran's MEE news agency claimed the deal would release $24 billion in frozen Iranian assets and cement Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. A senior Iranian source also told Reuters the draft would waive sanctions on Iran's oil, unfreeze billions of dollars of its fund, and require a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon. Trump responded on Truth Social, the terms that Iran leaked out to the fake news have nothing to do with the terms that were agreed to in writing. Very dishonorable people to deal with. They better get their act together and fast. Meanwhile, a senior Trump official told the press that Iran had agreed to the destruction of its nuclear material and subsequent removal from the country. They said Iran's frozen funds would be withheld until the deal's conditions are met and the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. They also said Iran will not fund allies in the Middle East like Hezbollah. One common denominator from both US and Iranian statements is that the ceasefire will include Lebanon, although divergence remains over what exactly that means. Israel, for one, has made it clear what it means to them. It will not withdraw from its so-called security zones in Lebanon or Syria or Gaza. Nor do many people inside Israel seem happy about the deal. One Israeli mocked its terms on X, saying, to Trump's credit, he actually said he would accept no agreement other than complete surrender. He just didn't specify whose. Others questioned Iran's long-standing friendship with the US. The war that began on February 28th was, in many ways, the ultimate illustration of an alliance. So how did we get from here to Trump saying, just in the last 24 hours, that Netanyahu has no judgment and is reckless? That is the question that we Israelis should be asking. Meanwhile, the odds on Netanyahu's political survival at home have taken a knock. Today, we'll go through each party's reactions and likely responses to the deal, beginning with Israel's. Here to help is Nomi Bar Yaakov, former Israeli negotiator, diplomat, and now associate fellow at Chatham House. Nomi, welcome to MEELive. We're just having an issue connecting Nomi to the line. Please stay with us for just a few minutes. Thank you for staying with us, and Nomi, welcome to MEELive. How popular is this deal in Israel as it stands today? Nomi, can you hear me? I've just been able to see you. Hello, Nomi?
I can hear you. I can't hear her. Is it live? Are you recording live?
We're having an issue with the sound channel, so Nomi can't hear me, but I can hear her. So hopefully that's a good sign, and we'll be able to get her back in just a second. Thank you for standing by. And Nomi, welcome to MEELive. It's great to have you. Can you give us a sense of how the US-Iran deal has been received in Israel today?
Well, I think there's much concern about the deal, not only with the current government, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Messianic coalition, but also with the opposition. We've seen that actually they were hitting far from the right. So yesterday, both Prime Minister Netanyahu and the leading candidate to take over the premiership, Naftali Bennett, gave press conferences. And the first thing the first thing Netanyahu said is that Israel wasn't a part of the deal and they will maintain a freedom of action in Lebanon and presumably beyond, and that there will be no troop withdrawal, etc. And that's very, very important because today Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said exactly the opposite, that full troop withdrawal, end of an occupation, is part of the memorandum of understanding. But regarding how it was received, Naftali Bennett, who's the leading candidate to succeed Netanyahu, said that under his premiership there will be regime change and he will succeed in implementing the original goals of the war that Israel and the US launched on the 28th of February this year, namely regime change and an end to the nuclear weapons program, but not in the same way that is outlined in the Memorandum of Understanding.
So there's a lot for Netanyahu to consider here, but not least among the things to consider are the relationship between Israel and the US. And even up to this point, it seemed that Trump and Netanyahu's relationship had become quite strained. This was already the case before Netanyahu disrupted Trump's birthday plans by ordering a Sunday evening strike on Beirut, just as Trump announced the agreement had been reached. This time, has that friendship, have Netanyahu and Trump really fallen out?
I think the relationship has been strained for a very long time. And I think that President Trump realized very early on, after the 28th of October, that Netanyahu's presentation on Netanyahu's seventh visit to the US since he took office in January of last year, since Trump took office, that the presentation claiming that regime change will be a piece of cake and won't be a problem, I think that he has realized that Netanyahu misled him and that he's been very angry about it ever since. Mm-hmm. And I think he's growing angrier and angrier, and he's voicing that not only in private conversations with Netanyahu, which are leaked word for word, using words that I wouldn't like to repeat on air, but I think they have been very widely circled. And I think that the relationship is extremely strained and very problematic, not only Netanyahu-Trump, but US-Israel. And I don't think that the US-Israel, whether it will be another Republican government or whether it will be another administration or whether it will be a Democratic administration, I don't think that the relationship between the US and Israel will ever be the same. So yes, extremely strained, extremely problematic, not only in the short run, but certainly long term.
And that has a lot of ramifications for Israel, not least militarily, if they do decide to pursue their advances in Lebanon. If that is the case, and indeed if Iran takes up or holds true to its threats to act in defense of Lebanon, do you think that the Israeli military is capable of fighting this war without America's help?
No, I think that in Lebanon they are fighting without American help, and I think they've also struck in Iran without American help. We saw that in June of 2025. The Americans only helped on the 12th day with the B-2 bombers, and in Lebanon they're acting independently of the US. So the real question for me is what will happen, given that there is a massive discrepancy in the way that the Memorandum of Understanding is interpreted. Netanyahu has understood it, or says he's understood it, that Israel is meant to only withdraw to the so-called yellow line. And as I said, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke very clearly this morning, saying that this agreement is between, in his words, the US and Israel, and Iran and Hezbollah. So that is a new equation in the Middle East, and that means that Iran will defend Hezbollah, and the only answer to that is a full Israeli withdrawal. And I mean, Hezbollah came into being because of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, including Beirut, in 1982, and every minute that Israel stays in Lebanese sovereign territory, they are strengthening Hezbollah and weakening the Lebanese government. So the question for me is, when will the Israeli government people, including opposition parties, given that their election's scheduled for October this year, when will the penny drop there, and when will they realize that with every minute that Israel stays in Lebanon, they are threatening Israel's own national security by strengthening Hezbollah and weakening the Lebanese government, who is very, very interested in a full peace agreement with Israel.
I suppose it's very, very clear then what you think they should do. But faced with these competing forces, the power of Trump's demands versus the power of the Israeli electorate and the Israeli opposition's demand to continue aggression in Lebanon, what do you think Netanyahu will do?
Well, I mean, Israel is existentially dependent on US aid. So if Trump is very clear with Netanyahu and he says, if you dream or dare carry out further attacks in Lebanon, and the question is also where in Lebanon, whether it's within the so-called yellow line, southern Lebanon, or whether it's north of that line, we will not, the US will not provide aid to Israel in any shape or form. Of course, that has to pass through various loops in Washington, but it probably will. So I think that the real question right there is what kind of leverage is Trump willing to exercise over Netanyahu? So the ball really is in his court, and I think at this given moment in time, Trump is probably going to exercise more leverage on Netanyahu than in the past. That said, Netanyahu will do absolutely everything to stay in power and avoid a prison sentence. We're at the stage with his trial where the prosecution, he didn't really defend himself very well. He didn't take it seriously. He thought he would succeed with the judicial overhaul plan, and that by the time that the prosecution, by the time it will move from defense to prosecution, that basically the judiciary will be in his pockets. That didn't happen, and he's basically pleading. He pleaded for tomorrow to only have, or to postpone his trial or shorten it. The judges are very, very stringent. He's in deep, deep trouble with his trial, and that's very dangerous because he's fearful of elections. He's fearful of the implications of this memorandum of understanding, and he could, and he's unpredictable. So again, very stressful times, not predictable post-signing, assuming there will be a signing on Friday. But Israel did attack Lebanon today. So really everything depends on US President Donald Trump.
And just finally, on Netanyahu and his political survival, Netanyahu is often called Israel's Houdini, but can he escape this quagmire, or is the US-Iran deal the nail in his coffin?
No, I don't think it's a nail in his coffin. I think, I think that, first of all, I don't know where the US-Iran deal is going. I think it's not, first, I wouldn't describe it as a deal. We've got a 1.5-page, 14-point memorandum of understanding. We're very, very, very long way away from a deal, assuming you're talking about a peace deal. So I think we have to be very cautious. And I think it's drafted in such a way that each side can more or less interpret it the way they want. And first of all, between today and Friday, a lot can happen. The 3 days already, there's some deaths in Lebanon, and Netanyahu will do everything he can to try to disrupt the deal. I do think that hopefully the deal will be signed. Obviously, there's a flurry of diplomatic activity, and it's very unusual for it's not a deal for the for the text of the memorandum of understanding not to have been released. But the big question is then what happens next? What happens thereafter? And again, the fact that it is an election year in Israel, and the fact that Netanyahu is going to end up in prison unless something dramatic happens, he is very unpredictable and very dangerous at this given moment in time.
And on that note, Nomi Bar Yaakov, thank you so much for your time. And it's not just Netanyahu here. Every party is thinking about how to sell the situation back home. And this explains the vastly different accounts of the deal being reported in Iranian and US media. But Trump's PR team is not just competing with Iran. They're also competing with ex-US President Barack Obama, whose 2015 nuclear deal with Iran forms a benchmark against which any new deal will be measured. Trump tore up the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action during his first first term as president, and with it, nearly 2 years of negotiations. There is also, of course, what Trump said that he wanted from this war.
We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
My colleague Sean Matthews joins me now. Sean, you just heard it from Trump: ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, proxies, and regime change. Has Trump achieved any of his stated goals?
Yeah, I think he's striking out on all counts, it looks like. Not only that, but he appears to be making some big concessions to the Iranians. Just before joining, I was texting a friend in the Gulf, a Gulf diplomat, about a report I'm seeing that the U.S. has agreed to waive sanctions on Iranian oil sales. So that looks like it's dropping in real time, and is quite interesting. If the U.S. is going to drop sanctions on any Iranian oil sales, that's a massive concession to make before even entering the negotiating table. And really what's going on here, Matilda, is that Trump looks like he has been boxed into this ceasefire deal or extension of a ceasefire without achieving any of his objectives, because the Iranians have got new chips on the board, basically, with their control of the Strait of Hormuz. So Trump is obviously under the gun going into the summer here, when there's a big driving season in the U.S., when reserves of oil are running out across the globe, especially in the West. Trump is under the gun to kind of get Hormuz open. And he's making concessions to the Iranians, it seems like, quite the opposite of his speech.
Yeah, and there's a lot then to ask about how and whether he will successfully sell it at home, not just to his voters, but also to his party, because the war has ruptured factions inside the Trump space between the America First and the sort of hawkish interventionists. I wonder if those divisions are going to play out now, given that this deal essentially depends entirely on Israel and whether Trump restrains or chooses to restrain Israel. He appears to have dragged Tel Aviv into a ceasefire that they don't want to be part of. Israel has expressed its intention to continue on warfare in Lebanon. Does the deal depend on Israel's compliance, the US's ability to restrain Israel, or is there a scenario in which this marks the end of the US involvement in the war, but actually it could just continue without Trump?
No one I speak with in the region or U.S. officials, I mean, no one in their right mind believes that, the U.S. could walk away, make a deal, and let Israel continue fighting, and that deal would hold. It's the Iranians have been very consistent and very clear that any ceasefire extension has to include Lebanon, which means that the Israelis cannot continue to wage war on Lebanon, with their bombing campaign there. Of course, the Israelis are still entrenched in Lebanon, but in terms of the strikes, Trump needs to rein those Israeli strikes in. That's very clear. And there's no chance, that the Israelis could continue to go to war with Iran without U.S. protection. I mean, as we saw very clearly in the opening months of the conflict and in the previous war, the June 2025 war between Israel and Iran that the U.S. entered late, Israel is dependent on U.S. interceptors, and U.S. air cover. And of course, don't forget, Matilda, right now, Trump has been meeting with officials from the Gulf at the G7 summit. Obviously, those leaders are not part of the G7, but they have come to the conference to meet with Trump. So Trump has sat down with the ruler of Qatar and the UAE. And Trump is under intense pressure from the Gulf states to see to it that Israel kind of abides to this ceasefire and that no fighting flares up again. So on all sides, Trump is really tied to enforcing this ceasefire, and he cannot, walk away and wash his hands of it.
Wow, okay, so that really puts a lot of pressure on how he handles Netanyahu and how he handles Israel in the coming week. And I suppose that also means a lot remains very fragile with the memorandum of understanding. Do you think that there's a very real risk of it falling through before the signing on Friday?
I mean, we have less than 3 days here. I think that, Israel would surely like it to fall through. Most folks that I speak with in the region and in Washington and in Europe also, they're pretty confident that there will be some kind of a signing on Friday, simply because, Trump he's come out and announced this. The Pakistanis have kind of doubled down on this. He has met with the Gulf rulers. He has met with the Qataris and the Emiratis now, who have both backed this agreement. So he's boxed himself in. I mean, if it falls through now, it would look pretty bad for Trump. Remember, Trump is also now exercising political capital to defend this deal. Vice President J.D. Vance has taken kind of the front row seat the last 24 hours, going out to U.S. Network television stations, defending the agreement. I think doing some gymnastics to kind of, frame this as a win in terms of the Trump administration's war goals. But he's doing some gymnastics to defend this agreement. So the Trump administration, clearly what we're seeing in these last 48 hours is really invested in this memorandum. And don't forget, I mean, the memorandum you can have a signing ceremony on Friday, and after 60 days, which is kind of the expected time frame of this agreement, you could have a return to conflict. This is not a permanent ceasefire, or permanent truce. It's a ceasefire.
And something you've already pointed out is that the US has its relationship with the Gulf states to think about. These are relationships that need some repairing. I want to talk about Oman here. Oman is the US's oldest treaty partner in the Gulf. That goes back to 1833. Yet during the war, Trump at one point threatened to blow them up. That's a quote. This was over Oman's refusal to renounce Iran's call to join it in charging a toll in the Strait of Hormuz, as you reported. But despite this tension with the US ally, you argue in a new piece on MEE that Oman is emerging as the biggest winner in this post-war potential world order. How so?
Yeah, well, thank you for drawing attention to the piece. It's one of those great pieces that we do at MEELive where we combine, I think, kind of the diplomatic dealings and the background content that we're hearing from our sources in the U.S. and the region, with just really, really clear-cutting analysis from all sides. We have a good array of voices in that piece. And as you laid out, right, what I wanted to do with that piece was kind of contrast where Oman stood at the beginning of the war. So Trump really, issued a broadside against Oman, threatening to bomb it. Obviously, because there was some frustration, U.S. officials told me that Oman had not unequivocally condemned Iran's call to enforce a toll in the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, Oman is really central to Iran's ambitions in Hormuz, because Iran and Oman are the two countries whose territorial waters basically comprise the waterway. So if Oman is on board with Iran, Iran has a lot of international kind of, backing to kind of see this through. Potentially not a toll, which would be considered illegal under international law, but an environmental fee or a service fee. We also admittedly cited a fantastic piece during the height of the war, looking at how Iran and Oman could impose that fee in the Strait of Hormuz, from a lot of international law experts kind of in maritime law. So what I was told was that basically Trump's threat stemmed from frustration with the Omanis that they did not come out unequivocally and kind of distance themselves from this Iranian position. Of course, also, right, remember back in April there was a big GCC meeting in Jeddah, and the Omanis were notably absent from that meeting. So the Omanis were getting some pressure from their Gulf neighbors as well. And this is interesting. This is from both sides, from the Emiratis and from the Saudis. Despite the tensions between the two, when the Iranian kind of missile and drones were really hitting into the Gulf states, Oman was under a lot of pressure to condemn those strikes. And the Omanis, of course, what they did, they issued this statement kind of saying that the U.S. had been dragged into the war by Israel. The Omani foreign minister wrote this, really scathing piece in The Economist magazine, criticizing the U.S. policy. So I laid all that out in the piece. And then what we did was kind of talk to analysts and officials in the region, noting that basically the tables have really turned, and that what's happening right now, it looks like, is that the Gulf states, all of them, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, everyone is playing catch up with Oman's position, I would say. Obviously, the Omanis were very conciliatory towards Iran. The Omanis were always opposed to this conflict because they recognized, as the Omani diplomats that I spoke with would say, right, kind of that they are bound to Iran by geography, by shared culture. They had no interest in kind of launching this war. And now the Gulf states are also kind of having to take this conciliatory approach to Iran. Obviously, some states were kind of more forward-leaning than that. Qatar was one of the more forward-leaning ones. The Saudis, although they, they had to walk a very fine line, kind of with the U.S. bases that are in their country, but eventually the Saudis also threw their weight behind diplomacy. But the Omanis, they really kind of were at the forefront of being conciliatory to the Iranians, and trying to find a way to work with them. And now it looks like the Gulf states are basically playing catch up with Oman. So the idea for this piece was to show the changing region and to show that Oman really offers a window into understanding the region, and that far from being an outlier, Oman now looks like the trailblazer. There was a report from Reuters recently. I could not confirm it with my sources, but I should say that multiple Gulf officials that I spoke with in many countries in the region and U.S. officials were discussing this story, that the Emiratis have paid billions of dollars to the Iranians, basically in protection money to prevent strikes. And that story has been circulated far and wide in the Gulf. And again, I couldn't independently confirm it, but it is the talk of the town, I think, in many Arab capitals and in Washington.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about it more actually in our next interview. And I'm really sorry I have to shut you off, but you have given us a very good segue into our next interview, which will focus on the Gulf more. So, Sean Matthews, thank you so much for your time as always. Now, the Gulf region has been the backdrop both to the war and to the makings of this potential peace deal. Iran's retaliation against its US foe has been directed towards its neighbours who play host to US air bases. This has tested their relationships both with their Iranian neighbour and with their US ally who initiated a war into which they were dragged against their explicit wishes. The Gulf states' respective roles in the peace negotiations illustrate a world order that is shifting and has shifted over the course of this war. Andreas Krieg is a security studies lecturer at King's College London and Gulf analyst, and he's here to help break it down. Andreas, welcome back to MEELive. Now, along with Pakistan, the Gulf region has been key to the mechanics of this deal. Though they've taken different postures during the conflict, it does appear most have played some role in the deal's formulation. Why are Gulf Arab states appearing overwhelmingly in support of the deal? Is this an expression of support for the US and for Trump?
Absolutely not. I think this is out of pure pragmatism and understanding the sort of complexities of the security environment that they're in. They're in a shared geography with Iran, and that is not going to change. Even a country like the UAE, which is very closely aligned with Israel, understands that there is no escape from this quite superior force to their north in Iran, and also that they understand that there isn't anyone who's going to come and help them. The United States have not they were not a protector of the GCC, and much more have probably put them on the target list of the Iranians. So in the context of all of that, knowing that Trump is also really not a deal maker as he promised to be, they understood that the only way out is pulling together and saying, okay, we need to find a deal to get back to trade and opening up the Strait of Hormuz, which is exactly what the primary objective of all of this is, because otherwise a frozen conflict with the Strait of Hormuz closed is obviously going to be detrimental to their wealth and their prosperity. But obviously even in that there are different positions. I think it's quite clear that Qatar has played an immensely powerful role in the background. They've tried to keep it silent. They've tried to stay in the shadows, giving Pakistan the lead. But actually a lot of the negotiation that's been going on over the last 2 weeks has gone on either through Doha or by Qatari diplomats flying to Islamabad, flying to Tehran in order to broker this MOU.
Qatar certainly seems to have played a really key role mediating, but not just Qatar. Actually, the FT reported a detailed outline of the process. We see Saudi and Emirati leaders collectively calling the US president as he repeatedly wavers over resuming all-out warfare. So as you point out, it is a sort of real coming together. And that wasn't always a given. If we look at the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, there is certainly today some opposition to the deal, a growing sense that Tehran has gained leverage over the course of this war. And during the war, the UAE not only launched dozens of strikes on the Islamic Republic, but tried to prevent Pakistan from mediating between Tehran and Washington. However, on the other hand, we just heard from my colleague Sean, and it was reported in Reuters as well, that the UAE agreed to pay Iran billions of dollars to stop attacking it. We've seen Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officials invited over by security advisor in the UAE. So the UAE has denied these reports. Nevertheless, they seem to be the talk of the town, to quote my colleague Sean. How do we make sense of this pivot on the part of the UAE?
I think the UAE is probably the most interesting one because they have really shifted on that continuum, which at the beginning of the war, we had Oman on one side, very clear that they played the neutrality card. Diplomacy was the only way forward. At the other end of the spectrum, we had the UAE that at that time was talking about defiance, strength, projecting strength. It was about coercion. It was about deterrence. And now obviously they pulled out $3 billion from Pakistan as a punishment for Pakistan taking a more conciliatory approach towards Iran. And now it seems they've come around to actually embrace the MOU and the diplomatic process, supporting the Qatari efforts. What is quite interesting in all of that is that there is tension going on clearly within Abu Dhabi and also between Abu Dhabi and the Northern Emirates over how to deal with Iran. The MBZ, the president's position has been that of defiance, of strength, of deterrence rather than entanglement and engagement. And then you have Tahnoun bin Zayed, who suddenly reappeared on the surface. I mean, he'd been nowhere to be seen for a month, has now come back to kind of lead on that policy issue. And it has been his sort of strategic mindset, this idea of entanglement, engagement, weaponized interdependence through commercial networks, that kind of led the sort of policy in the UAE to say, look, we allow the Iranians, we allow the IRGC to do business in the UAE, and thereby in return, we will not be attacked. That clearly didn't, this kind of equation didn't in the end come to fruition. But nonetheless, there was no alternative. Tahnoun bin Zayed put his foot down and said, look, we cannot win this militarily. Israel is not there to win the war for us because they can't win the war for themselves. The US doesn't want an all-out war. The GCC, the partners around us, don't want a war. So we really have no option but to come to the negotiation table. And it seems that Tahnoun has won this part of the conflict over MBZ's approach, which was far more assertive early on. And again, the idea being that maybe a united GCC position is far better for national interest in the UAE than one where everyone pulls into opposite directions.
For Iran's part, what does Iran need to do to re-earn the trust of its neighbours? You know, we've seen these huge conciliatory strides made, this great cooperation by the GCC in trying to re-establish peace and stability in the region. What about Iran? What does Iran need to do as a show of faith to the Gulf?
The number one sticking point, the one issue that we all need to think about and that the GCC is thinking about is freedom of navigation around the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians have to show not just goodwill, but they have to stick to international law and really show that they will open up the Strait of Hormuz to allow free passage and trade to the GCC from the GCC to then reboost the global economy, but obviously also specifically energy markets. And so it has to be made very clear that there is now a way for shipping companies to go through the strait. I think that's the number one thing. But it's I think too premature to just think about rebuilding trust. I think whatever trust was there before the war has completely evaporated now on all sides. I would even include Oman in this. The idea that now the GCC will just return to a situation ex ante is just not going to happen. And also Qatar, which had a long-standing relationship with Iran, is now really has to focus on how to manage that relationship. I think the realization, though, is it is one of interconnectivity. It's one of shared geography. But ultimately, the Iranians will have to show that they mean business. And mind you, there's still a lot of voices in Iran who are pushing back against this deal, who are pushing back against the MOU. And those people might still, these hardliners might win over those who were more pragmatic in kind of getting into an MOU. So trust is not there, and it will take years to rebuild, if that.
Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us here today. Now, at the epicenter of the war's violence today, no one needs more peace than the one country whose inclusion in the deal remains a big question mark.
Lebanon, a new front in a spiralling war. This Israel's response to Hezbollah entering the fray. Revenge for the Iranian-backed group launching a barrage of rockets.
Just the past few hours, Israel...
Lebanon, a new front in a spiralling war. This Israel's response.
Appears we're having an issue with that video. I'll let you know if we can get it back to play. But that recounted the violence that Lebanon has experienced, the displacement of over 1 million people. Now, when the breakthrough with this peace agreement was announced on Sunday. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, whose nation has been mediating, said it included the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. That's a quote. If this is true, it appears to be true on paper alone so far. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz said that the military will not withdraw from the swathes of Lebanon's south that it has occupied. He said these security zones, as they call them, will be cleared of local residents and all terror infrastructure, as they call it, destroyed. He said that the holding of these zones was among the IDF's greatest achievements in this war. Unambiguously, he also declared Israel will not withdraw despite all existing pressures and those that will still come. Netanyahu has also reiterated this. US officials were then quick to water down the apparent commitment to peace in Lebanon, saying that while Lebanon is covered by the ceasefire framework, the withdrawal of Israeli forces is not a strict condition. Israel, they said, would retain the right to self-defense. Where does that leave Lebanon? And does any deal exist without it? Fawaz Gerges is a Lebanese American academic and author of The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East. He joins me now. Fawaz, welcome back to MEELive. Now, we've just heard US officials said Israel would retain the right to self-defense, referring to its occupation of South Lebanon. If the right to self-defense includes occupying sovereign Lebanese territory, what doesn't it include?
It really means that Israel can do whatever it wants. The same language was used during the ceasefire in Gaza, and we know what has been happening in Gaza. When the ceasefire was signed in Gaza, Israel occupied 53% of the Gaza Strip. Now Israel occupies or will occupy 70% of the Gaza Strip. Israel has killed more than 900 Palestinians since the ceasefire was signed in Gaza. We're witnessing a similar tragedy unfolding before our eyes in Lebanon. In the past 24 hours, since the framework of understanding between the United States and Iran was signed, Israel has killed 24 Lebanese and injured 70, according to Lebanon's health authority. As you and I are talking now, Israel is shelling Nabateeh, one of the largest cities in the south. It's burning homes, razing homes, and basically under the idea of trying to consolidate the areas under its occupation, what it calls the security zone. So the big picture for our viewers, nothing seems to have changed since the framework was signed, and I doubted very much whether Israel will end its offensive or even pull out its forces from southern Lebanon.
But that apparently is a sticking point for this deal. And it's one thing whether the US is prepared to accept these strikes on Nabateeh as self-defense, this broad sort of sweeping definition of self-defense. It's another thing whether Iran is prepared to accept that, because Iran has previously demonstrated last week that it will actually take direct action in retaliation against strikes on Lebanon. Whether or not it stays true to its threats to continue to do so is another question. I suppose that is the question. Do you think that Iran will come to Lebanon's defense? Do people in Lebanon feel that Iran will come to their defense as promised?
Well, the context during the talks between the United States and Iran over the past few weeks, Lebanon was one of the most important blocks, impediments, because Iran insisted that any ceasefire between the United States and Iran includes the end of Israeli hostilities in Lebanon and basically withdrawal of Israeli forces from the so-called security zone. Just today, yesterday and today, Iran's foreign minister has reiterated the fact that one of the major aspects of the framework of understanding not only cessation of hostilities, but also Israel withdrawing its forces from Lebanon. Just today, Hezbollah has reiterated that Iran has communicated to Hezbollah, according to top Hezbollah leaders, that Iran will not sign the final nuclear deal if Israel does not really pull out all its forces from southern Lebanon. So the fact is that Israel has already rejected the linkage between the American-Iranian framework of understanding and its occupation of a so-called security zone. The question on the table is the following. Will President Trump have the desire and will to exert pressure on Netanyahu in order not only to stop, to end hostilities, but also to pull out from southern Lebanon? So far, I'm not convinced, because Netanyahu will find ways and means to continue his forever war, as we have seen in Gaza and now we are seeing in Lebanon. And the bigger question for our viewers, for our listeners, is that Benjamin Netanyahu is facing the battle of his life. His political future, his political legacy is online, because there will be elections in Israel, and there is widespread sentiment inside Israel that his overarching strategy has failed. It has failed in Gaza, it has failed in Lebanon, and most importantly, it has failed in Iran. All he boasted about, that bringing about regime change in Iran, changing the face of the Middle East, Israel becoming a global power, quote unquote, not a regional power, in Netanyahu's word, this is all delusional. That's really what the Israeli now remember about Netanyahu, and that's why, to come back to Lebanon, his basically political future and legacy lies in greater and bigger rubble, making rubble, great, tragedies in southern Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. And if it falls upon Trump to act to restrain Netanyahu in order for this peace deal to go ahead, so far from Trump, we have seen little more than a willingness to use very strong language, a very angry language in phone calls with the Israeli Prime Minister. But it will be very interesting to see if that changes. I suppose where we have heard a different tone is from Lebanese President Joseph Aoun, who welcomed the announcement of the memorandum, saying in a statement that he looked forward to the understanding translating into practical steps that will put a definitive end to the cycle of violence. Is his optimism echoed among the wider population in Lebanon?
Well, sadly, no. Because the Lebanese people will have to see it to believe it. They have experienced Israeli military incursions, invasions, and occupation in the past 40 years. They know what Israel is capable of. And I think what's unique about Israel's wider offensive, military offensive in Lebanon in the past few months is the extent of the destruction of civilian infrastructure, is the extent of the destruction of all ingredients, aspect of life in the south. What Israel is really trying to do is to prevent the return of hundreds of thousands of Lebanese to the south, because by razing not only their villages and their hamlets, destroying basically the habitat. And this tells me, and the Lebanese people know, that Israel really is trying to occupy a security zone, a huge security zone for a long time.
Fawaz Gerges, thank you so much for joining me once again. Now, finally, Iran. Like the White House, Tehran has maneuvered to present the deal in favourable terms to its domestic population. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Kazim Garibabadi said, quote, "The enemy launched this war to achieve its own objectives, but it failed on every front, while the Islamic Republic of Iran achieved major victories." Now, in many cases, the more grandiose victories claimed by each side appear to remain unfinalised. A preliminary agreement only has been signed electronically by Trump, Vance and Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. It is reportedly only a page and a half. On the other side, US officials say that technical talks on Iran's nuclear program are expected to begin this week, and that any sanctions relief or release of assets will depend on progress on this front. Nuclear enrichment was once a non-negotiable point for Tehran. So how have the goalposts shifted? Has Iran done better or worse than the US? And is it better or worse off now than it was before the war? Negar Mortazevi is an Iranian political analyst and a senior fellow at the Center for International Politics policy, and she joins me now. Negar, welcome. We have seen a lot of competing narratives about what this agreement contains. What concessions has Iran made that you're aware of, for example, on this question of nuclear material?
Thank you for having me, Matilda. So Iran and the U.S. both have made concessions, showed flexibility to try to bring this to the finish line with the historic help of mediators. The Pakistanis really pushing the Qataris until the last moment. And it seems like Iran has tried to be flexible on the nuclear program. The details of that final deal will be clear once the negotiations start, which is going to be after the signing of this MOU. The 60 days period after is what Iran has agreed to talk about the nuclear program enrichment, has committed to not weaponize the program, essentially not build nuclear weapons, which is something President Trump kept saying, and also to deal with the highly enriched uranium, the stockpile President Trump calls nuclear dust. But the details are going to be negotiated, and this is going to be in exchange for sanctions relief, for the unfreezing of Iranian assets step by step. But just in general, I think Tehran understands that this, for President Trump, is very much domestic, and they have signaled publicly and privately that they're willing to deliver a deal that is better than the deal made by President Obama or the JCPOA. Now we have to wait and see if that actually happens.
And it has taken an extraordinary amount of work to get to this point, to get both sides to agree to a framework of trust. What we've sort of heard throughout the course of this show is that the big question mark then remains over Lebanon, and Israel has expressed no intention to withdraw. Iran has previously demonstrated a willingness to take direct retaliatory action on behalf of Lebanon, and Trump so far hasn't done much more to restrain Netanyahu than swear at him on the telephone. I suppose then, in the situation that Israel does not withdraw, and that, as we're being told, Lebanon is a non-negotiable part of this deal, do you see Iran resuming military action in defense of Lebanon?
Well, Iran drew a red line during a ceasefire, even before agreeing to this memorandum. They drew a red line on attacks on Beirut, and they did respond to Israel for the first time. It was unprecedented when Israel attacked an ally. This was the attack on Beirut last week, and Iran responded by attacking Israel. And then after that, President Trump put some pressure on Israel to try to close that chapter. And then Israel went again for attacks very clearly aimed at sabotaging this deal and torpedoing it, which is something that has been a pattern for Benjamin Netanyahu. Right before or right after signing deals, ceasefires, he goes in with more attacks. We know that Iran is not willing to drop Lebanon, and this is something that's very much in the agreement, that Lebanon will be included in that final peace deal and the end of the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. President Trump has said it in a public statement that this includes Lebanon, but the details are not still very clear. In fact, I think are still being, pushed from both sides. What does that exactly mean as far as including Lebanon, ending the fighting right now, meaning stop shooting, sort of a ceasefire? How long is the pulling out of Lebanon going to take? That seems to be, a discussion as far as a process. And then, that pressure is very much required from President Trump, from the White House on Israel, not a one-time pressure, but a sustained pressure to keep that peace in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. And the commitment is also both sides. So Iran and its allies having a non-aggression pact with the U.S. and its allies, which very much includes Israel. So I think that's a very important issue. It's a sticking point, and it's something that a third party, essentially Israel, who's not at the negotiating table, and also Lebanon, who's not at the negotiating table, or Hezbollah, it has to do with these parties, and the pressure has to come from Iran and Washington to try to keep that peace intact.
Hearing all of those question marks, it's easy to feel as though not that much has actually changed today from where we were sitting a few days ago. But of course, Iran's foreign ministry has been declaring victory. For its part, so has the White House. But looking at Iran, how has news of the deal been received among the Iranian people?
There's, I think, a sense of relief and essentially a hope to return to normalcy, I would say, by the majority of the population. Of course, we don't have scientific polls, but there's also a hardline faction that is opposed to this deal. We've seen them oppose it in the media, in the hardline media, little protests outside the foreign ministry, even hardline members of parliament. But these are not the people at that top decision-making table. So the decision to make this deal, to agree to it, and then to go and sign it is coming from the top. And I would say the majority of the Iranian people are just going to be relieved that this war, which has been very devastating, the bombing, the killing, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the war started by an attack on a school full of children, hospitals, universities, lots of civilian infrastructure has been attacked. And so people just can't wait to return to normalcy. Also here where I am in Doha, across the region, I think civilians are just waiting for this war to end.
Now, you mentioned the opposition within the sort of hardline wing of the administration. There's also been opposition expressed by Reza Pahlavi in an interview with The Times that just came out yesterday. And he said, I quote, "Any deal with this Iranian regime will fail and is morally wrong." He is, of course, not speaking from the region. What is your response to that interview? And I suppose the apparent shift we've seen that it reflects in Trump's attitude towards the standing government in Iran.
Yes, I mean, just a parallel to that sort of hardline radical group that's opposed to the deal and essentially ending the war. There's also a more radical group on the opposite side that has been opposed to the entirety of the system, to the status quo, to the point of even supporting the war, thinking that this would bring change. Of course, it didn't. They, are represented very much in the Iranian diaspora across the world, in the US, in Europe specifically. And also there is a base of that support inside the country. I think it's small and it has been shrinking once the war started and people actually saw the execution of these freedom bombs bringing quote unquote help to the Iranian people, which absolutely wasn't true. But yeah, I mean, that is part of sort of the political discourse inside and outside. But I would say going back to sort of that chunk in the middle, the majority of the Iranian people, which is now sort of represented by this group that is doing the deal and bringing an end to the war, are very much waiting for it to end.
Negar Mortadzavi, thank you so much for your time. And there we have the playing field of this agreement, a fragile and largely unpublished agreement between US and Iran that has been worked for very, very, very diligently by the Gulf region, applying a lot of pressure for peace, but a big question mark over the front in Lebanon, where Israel has expressed no intention to not continue their aggression, leaving the ball, I suppose, in Trump's court to hold them to account. That is all that we have time for on today's show. To all of you watching, thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, make sure you're following us on social media at Middle East Eye. You can email MEELive@middleeasteye.net. I'll be here live at 5 every Tuesday and Thursday, noon if you're in New York. See you then.